Chapter 11. I rose as happy as if I had received my New Year presents. The wind was cold, the sky clear, the sea gleaming. I took the path to the village. Mass would have ended by now. As I walked along, I wondered, with an absurd emotion, who would be the first person, lucky or unlucky, I should meet this New Year. If only, I said to myself, it could be a small child with its arms loaded with its New Year toys. Or an active old man in a white shirt with full embroidered sleeves, content and proud that he had fulfilled his duty on earth with courage. The further I went and the closer I came to the village, the more troubled I became. Suddenly my knees gave way beneath me. Under the olive trees, walking with a springing step along the village road, appeared in red, with a black kerchief over her head, the graceful, slender-waisted figure of the widow. Her sinuous gait was really that of a black panther, and it seemed to me that an acrid scent of musk was distilled in the air. If only I could escape! I felt that, when angry, this beast would have no mercy, and that the only thing to do was to run away. But how? The widow was steadily approaching. The gravel seemed to be crunching as if an army were marching over it. She saw me, shook her head, her kerchief slipped down, and her hair appeared, black as jet and shining. She cast me a languorous look and smiled. Her eyes had a wild sweetness. Hastily she adjusted her kerchief, as though she were ashamed at having let me see one of woman's deepest secrets, her hair. I wanted to speak to her, wish her a happy New Year, but my throat was too tight, as on the day when the gallery fell in, and my life had been in danger. The reeds surrounding her garden stirred in the wind. The winter sun fell on the golden lemons and the oranges with their dark foliage. The entire garden was resplendent like a paradise. The widow stopped, stretched out her arm, and thrust the gate open. I was passing her just at that moment. She looked round and, raising her eyebrows, turned her gaze on me. She left the gate open, and I saw her disappear behind the orange trees, swaying her hips as she went. To enter that gate and bolt it, to run after her, take her by the waist and, without a word, drag her to her large widow's bed, that was what you would call being a man. That was what my grandfather would have done, and what I hope my grandson will do. But I stood there like a post, weighing things up and reflecting. In another life, I murmured, smiling bitterly, in some other life I'll behave better than this. I plunged into the green defile, feeling a weight on my soul as if I had committed a mortal sin. I wandered up and down. It was cold, and I was shivering. It was no use my chasing from my thoughts the widow's swaying hips, her smile, her eyes, her breasts. They always returned. I was suffocating. The trees had no leaves as yet, but the buds were full of sap and already swelling and bursting. In every bud you could feel the concentrated presence of young shoots, flowers, fruits to be, lying in wait and ready to burst out to the light. Day and night, in the middle of winter, the great miracle of spring was silently, secretly being prepared beneath the dry bark. Suddenly I gave a cry of joy. A bold almond tree opposite me in a sheltered hollow had burst into flower in midwinter, leading the way to all the other trees and heralding the spring. The oppression I felt left me. I took a deep breath of its somewhat peppery scent. I left the road and sat down beneath its flowering branches. I stayed there a long time, thinking of nothing, carefree and happy. This was eternity, and I was sitting beneath a tree in paradise. Suddenly a loud, rough voice ejected me from this paradise. "Now what might you be doing tucked away in there, boss? I've been looking high and low for you. It's close on 12. Come on." "Where?" "Where? You ask me where? To old Mother Sucking Pig, of course. Aren't you hungry? The sucking pig's out of the oven. What a smell! Makes your mouth water. Come on." I rose, stroked the hard trunk of the almond tree containing so many mysteries, and which had produced this miracle of blossom. Zorba went on ahead, light-footed, full of zest and hunger. The fundamental needs of man, food, drink, women, and dance, were never exhausted or dulled in his robust and eager body. He was holding in his hand a flat parcel wrapped in pink paper and tied with golden colored string. A New Year's gift? I asked with a smile. Zorba laughed, trying to hide his emotion. Well, just so she's no room for complaint, poor woman, he said without turning around. So she remembered her past grandeur. She's a woman, haven't we said so often enough? And therefore a creature always mourning over her lot. A photograph? You'll see, you'll see. Don't be in so great a hurry. I made it myself. Come on, we'd better get a move on. The midday sun was such as to gladden your very bones. The sea, too, was happily warming itself in the sun. In the distance, the tiny uninhabited island, shrouded in light mist, looked as if it had raised itself out of the sea and was floating. We approached the village, and Zorba came close to me and lowered his voice. "You know, boss," he said, "the person in question was at church. I was standing in front by the cantor when I suddenly saw the sacred icons light up. Christ, the Holy Virgin, and the 12 Apostles. Everything shone." "Whatever is happening?" I said, crossing myself. "Is it the sun?" I turned round. It was the widow. "All right, Zorba, that'll do," I said, hurrying on. But Zorba ran after me. "I saw her close to, boss. She's got a beauty spot on her cheek that's enough to send you crazy. Another of those mysteries, beauty spots on women's cheek." He opened wide his eyes with an air of stupefaction. "Have you noticed, boss? The skin's all soft and smooth, and then, all of a sudden, a black spot. Well, that's all that's needed. It sends you crazy. Do you understand that, boss? What do your books say about it?" "The devil take them!" Zorba laughed, pleased with himself. "That's the stuff!" he exclaimed. "That's the stuff! You're beginning to realize." We did not stop at the cafe. We pressed on. Our good lady had cooked a sucking pig for us in the oven and was waiting for us on her doorstep. She had put a canary yellow ribbon round her neck once more, and, to see her like that, heavily powdered, lips plastered with a thick layer of crimson, was enough to dismay anyone. Was she in fact the ship's figurehead? As soon as she caught sight of us, her whole flesh seemed to be gladdened and set in motion. Her small eyes danced naughtily in her head and came to rest fixed on Zorba's curled-up mustache. As soon as the outer door had closed behind us, Zorba took her by the waist. "Happy New Year, my Bubulina," he said. "Look what I've brought you," and he kissed her plump and wrinkled neck. The old siren was tickled for a moment, but did not lose her head. Her eyes were clamped on the present. She seized it, undid the golden string, looked inside, and uttered a cry of joy. I leaned forward to see what it was. On a thick piece of cardboard that rascal Zorba had drawn in 4 colors, red, gold, grey, and black, 4 huge battleships, decked with flags, sailing on an indigo blue sea. In front of the battleships, floating on the waves, all naked and white, with hair flowing, breasts in the air, and a spiral fishtail, was a siren, Dame Hortense, complete with yellow ribbon round her neck. She was holding 4 strings and pulling behind her the 4 battleships flying the flags of England, Russia, France, and Italy. In each corner of the picture hung a beard, 1 fair, 1 red, 1 grey, and 1 black. The old singer understood immediately. "Me," she said, pointing proudly to the siren. She sighed. "Ah, I used to be a great power too, once upon a time." She moved a small round mirror from over her bed, near to the parrot's cage, and, in its place, hung Zorba's picture. Beneath her thick makeup she must have gone pale. Zorba, meanwhile, had slipped into the kitchen. He was hungry. He brought in the dish with the sucking pig, placed a bottle of wine on the table in front of him, and filled 3 glasses. "Come, eat, eat!" he cried, clapping his hands together. Let's begin with the foundation, the belly. After that, my sweet will take care of what's below. But the atmosphere was troubled by the old siren's sighs. Each New Year she, too, had a little doomsday of her own. She looked back on her life, weighed it up, and found it wanting. Beneath this old woman's thinning hair, big cities, men, silk dresses, bottles of champagne, and scented beards rose from the graves of her memory on all solemn occasions. "I've no appetite," she murmured coyly. "None at all, none at all." She kneeled down before the brazier and poked the hot coals. Her flabby cheeks reflected the light of the fire. A lock of hair slipped from her brow and was sighing, singed by the flame. The nauseating smell of burnt hair permeated the room. "I won't eat, I won't eat," she muttered once more, seeing we were taking no notice of her at all. Zorba clenched his fist impatiently. He remained for a moment undecided. He could let her mutter to herself as much as she chose, while we got on with the roasted pig, or he could throw himself on his knees, take her in his arms, and calm her down with kind words. I watched the tanned face and saw, passing over his mobile features, waves of contradictory impulses. Suddenly his expression set. He had come to a decision. He knelt beside her and seized the siren's knees. "If you don't eat, my little charmer," he said in heart-rending tones, "it's the end of everything. Have pity on the poor pig, my lovely, and eat this sweet little trotter." And he pushed into her mouth the crackling trotter covered with butter. He took her in his arms, raised her from the ground, and placed her gently on her chair between the two of us. "Eat," he said, "eat, my treasure, so that Saint Basil will come to our village. If you don't, you know, he won't come to us. He'll go back to his own country of Caesarea. He'll pick up the inkhorn and paper and 12th cake, the New Year gifts, the children's toys, even this little sucking pig, and away with them all. So open your little mouth, my Bubulina, and eat." He put out 2 fingers and tickled her under the arm. The old siren chuckled with pleasure, wiped her small reddened eyes, and started busily to chew over the crankly trotter. Just at that moment 2 amorous cats began to howl on the roof over our heads. They howled in an indescribable tone of hatred, their voices rising and falling, threateningly. Suddenly we heard them scrambling wildly on the roof, tearing one another to pieces. "Meow, meow," said Zorba, winking at the old siren. She smiled and pressed his hand under the table. Her throat relaxed and she began to eat with appetite. The sun moved round, came in through the small window, and shone on the good lady's feet. The bottle was empty. Zorba had twisted up his mustaches like those of a wild cat and moved closer to the female of the species. Dame Hortense, huddled up, her head sunk into her shoulders, shuddered as she felt his warm venous breath on her. "Now what's this other mystery, boss?" said Zorba, looking round at me. "Everything goes backwards with me. When I was a kid, so it seems, I looked like a little old man. I was dense, didn't talk much, but had a big fellow's voice. They say I was like my granddad, but the older I grew, the more harum-scarum I became. I began doing wild things when I was 20. Oh, nothing special, just the same as other fellows at that age. When I was 40 I began to feel really young and went off on the maddest escapades. And now I'm over 60. 65, boss, but keep that dark, well, I'm over 60, but how can I explain? Honestly, the world's grown too small for me." He raised his glass and turned with compunction to his lady. "Your good health, Bubulina," he said solemnly. "May God see to it that this year you grow some teeth and some neat eyebrows, and a new skin scented like a peach, and that you do away with all these beastly little ribbons, and that there's another revolution in Crete, and the 4 great powers come back again, Bubulina, my dear, with their fleets, and that each fleet has its admiral, and each admiral his curled and scented beard. And may you rise from the waves once more, my siren, singing your lovely song, and may the fleets break to pieces on those two round and savage rocks. Whereupon he placed his big hands on the good lady's flabby hanging breasts. Zorba was getting lively again. His voice was hoarse with desire. I laughed. One day at the cinema I had seen a Turkish pasha frolicking in a Paris cabaret. He was holding a fair-haired young midinette on his lap. The pasha was getting excited. The tassel on his fez began to rise slowly, stopped for a moment when it was horizontal, then suddenly stuck straight up in the air. "What are you laughing at, boss?" Zorba asked. The good lady, however, was still thinking of what Zorba had been saying. "Oh," she said, "do you think it's possible, Zorba? But when youth goes, it never comes back." Zorba moved closer still. The two chairs stuck together. "Listen to me, ducky," he said, trying at the same time to undo the decisive button on her bodice. "Listen, let me tell you about the fine present I'm going to get you. There's a new doctor who performs miracles, they say. He gives you a medicine of some kind, drops or powder, I don't know which, and you become 20 again in a trice, 25 at the worst. Don't cry, my dear, I'll have some sent from Europe for you." The old siren started. Her reddish scalp was gleaming between the thinning hair. She threw her fat, fleshy arms round Zorba's neck. "If it's drops, my sweetie," she murmured, rubbing herself against Zorba like a cat, "you'll order me a demi-john for me, won't you? And if it's powerful, powder a sackful," said Zorba, undoing the third button. The cats, who had been quiet for a time, started their howling again. One of the voices was plaintive and appealing, the other angry and threatening. Our good lady yawned, and her eyes became languorous. "Do you hear those horrid cats?" she muttered. "They've no shame." And she sat on Zorba's knee. She leaned her head back against his neck and heaved a great sigh. She had drunk a little too much, and her eyes were growing misty. "What are you thinking about, my Bubulina?" Zorba asked, clutching hold of her breasts. "Alexandria," murmured the old siren, who had trundled about the world quite a bit. "Alexandria, Beirut, Constantinople, the Turks, the Arabs, sherbet, golden sandals, red fezzes." She heaved another sigh. "When Ali Bey stayed the night with me, what a mustache, what eyebrows, what arms he had! He'd call to the tambourine and flute players and throw them money through the window, so that they'd play in my courtyard until dawn. And the neighbors used to go green with envy. 'Ali Bey's there with her again,' they'd say in a rage. Afterwards in Constantinople, Suleiman Pasha would never let me go out at all on Fridays. He was afraid the Sultan might see me on the way to the mosque, and be so dazzled by my beauty he'd have me kidnapped. Every morning when he left the house, he'd put 3 big Negroes at the door to keep all males away from me. Ah, my little Suleiman." She took a large check handkerchief from her bodice and bit it, hissing like a turtle. Zorba got rid of her by placing her on the chair next to him and stood up, annoyed. He walked up and down once or twice, and he began hissing as well. The room was suddenly too cramped for him. He picked up his stick and rushed out into the yard, and I saw him lean the ladder against the wall and clamber up, 2 steps at a time, in a fury. "Who are you going to thrash, Zorba?" I shouted. "Suleiman Pasha? Those damned cats!" he shouted. "Can't they leave us for a single moment?" And in one bout he was on the roof. Dame Hortense, quite drunk, her hair disheveled, had now closed her inflamed eyes, and a discreet snore came from her toothless mouth. Sleep had lifted her up and transported her to the great cities of the East, into the closed gardens and dim harems of amorous pashas. Sleep let her pass through walls and sent her dreams. She could see herself fishing. She had thrown out 4 lines and caught 4 great battleships. Snoring and breathing heavily, the old siren smiled happily in her sleep, and seemingly refreshed by her bathe in the sea. Zorba came back, swinging his stick. "Sleeping, eh?" he said as he saw her. "The jade's asleep, is she?" Yes, Zorba Pasha, I answered. She's been carried off by the Dr. Voronov who makes old people young again. Sleep. She's only 20 and she's strolling about Alexandria and Beirut. Let her go to the devil, the old slut, Zorba growled and spat on the floor. Just look at the way she's grinning. I wonder who she's grinning at, the brazen bitch. Come on, boss, let's go. He slapped on his cap and opened the door. She's not all on her own, cried Zorba. She's with Suleiman Pasha. Can't you see? She's in her seventh heaven. The dirty cow. Come on, let's beat it. We went out into the cold air. The moon was sailing across a calm sky. Women, said Zorba in disgust. Ugh. Still, it's not your fault. It's the fault of harebrained harem-scarems like Suleiman and Zorba. And after a moment's pause, no, it's not even our fault, he went on furiously. There's one being who's the cause of it all, and one alone, the grand harebrained harem-scarem, the grand Suleiman Pasha. You know who. If he exists, I answered. What if he doesn't? God Almighty, then we're done for. For some time we strode along without a word. Zorba was certainly going over some wild ideas in his mind, because every second or so he would lash out at the pebbles with his stick and spit on the ground. Suddenly he turned on me. May God sanctify my granddad's bones, he said. He knew a thing or two about women. He liked them a lot, poor wretch, and they led him a regular dance in his lifetime. By all the good things I wish you, Alexis, my boy, he'd say, beware of women. When God took Adam's rib out to create woman, cursed that minute, the devil turned into a serpent, and he snatched the rib and ran off with it. God dashed after him and caught him, but he slipped out of his fingers and God was left with just the devil's horns in his hands. A good housekeeper, said God, can sew even with a spoon. Well, I'll create a woman with the devil's horns. And he did. And that's how the devil got us all, Alexis, my boy. No matter where you touch a woman, you touch the devil's horns. Beware of her, my boy. She also stole the apples in her garden, in the Garden of Eden. She shoved them down her bodice, and now she goes out and about, strutting all over the place. A plague on her. Eat any of those apples and you're lost. Don't eat any and you'll still be lost. What advice can I give you, then, my boy? Do as you please. That's what my old grandpa said to me. But how could you expect me to grow up sensible? I went the same way as he did. I went to the devil. We hurried through the village. The moonlight was disturbing. Imagine how it would be if you had been drinking and came out for a walk and found the world suddenly transformed. The roads had turned into rivers of milk. The holes in the road and the ruts overflow with chalk. The hills were covered with snow. Your hands, face and neck were phosphorescent, like a glowworm's tail, and the moon hung on your chest like an exotic round metal. We were walking along briskly in silence, intoxicated by the moonlight as well as by the wine. We hardly felt our feet touch the ground. Behind us in the sleeping village, the dogs had got up on the roofs and were howling at the moon. And we, for no reason at all, also felt a desire to stretch our necks toward the moon and began to howl. We came to the widow's garden. Zorba stopped. Wine, good food, and the moon had turned his head. He craned his neck and, in his big ass's voice, began to bray a bawdy couplet, which, in his excited state, he composed on the spur of the moment. She's another of the devil's horns, he said. Let's go, boss. Dawn was about to break when we arrived at the hut. I threw myself on my bed, worn out. Zorba washed, lit the stove, and made some coffee. He crouched on the floor by the door, lit a cigarette, and began to smoke placidly, his body straight and motionless, as he looked out at the sea. His face was grave and thoughtful. He reminded me of a Japanese painting I like. An ascetic sitting on his crossed legs and wrapped in a long orange-colored robe, his face shining like a carving in hard wood, blackened by the rain. His neck erect, smiling as he gazes without fear into the dark night. I looked at Zorba in the light of the moon and admired the jauntiness and simplicity with which he adapted himself to the world around him, the way his body and soul formed one harmonious whole, and all things, women, bread, water, meat, sleep, blended happily with his flesh and became Zorba. I had never seen such a friendly accord between a man and the universe. The moon would soon be setting now. It was round and of a pale green. An indescribable peacefulness spread across the sea. Zorba threw away his cigarette and reached out for a basket. He fumbled in it and pulled out some string, pulleys, and little pieces of wood. He lit the oil lamp and once more started to experiment with his overhead railway. Stopping over his primitive toy, he began to make calculations, which must have been extremely complicated and difficult. For every other second he scratched his head and furiously and swore. Suddenly he had had enough of it. He aimed one kick at the model and it crashed to the ground.